Welcome back and well done for finding the new room. We get around. We began the module last week, Tuesday, with a very brief introduction to the philosophy of mind. Because in cognitive science, even though you're trying to do science, you're never far from philosophy. Philosophical issues, questions constantly intrude, and you cannot really do good science in the field without being aware of these philosophical issues. So in that context, we began looking at two sets of issues that have continually arisen in different guises again and again over the several hundred years that we're concerned with. Issues to do with experience, the senses, observation, are empirical issues. From an empirical standpoint, we're interested in how we encounter the world, how we are embedded in the world, how we observe the world. Science is necessarily empirical because science starts with observation. It's the common world that we wish to characterize. But when you observe, you can always be wrong. Furthermore, no matter how often and how securely you observe, it's always possible that you're going to be surprised, that the next observation is going to make you alter your beliefs. So that knowledge obtained in this way is never 100% certain. It's as good as we can get. Those suite of concerns contrast with those who place a great deal of emphasis on the certainty of knowledge and on the use of reason. Now, when we reason or apply logic in our thought chain, then we're trying to preserve the truth of what we say. We start from some premises and we reason to other premises, making sure that we don't introduce errors along the way. You're familiar with this from mathematics. Mathematics is quite different from empirical science. It's not done starting with observation of the world. Knowledge obtained in this way, through reasoning, should be certain if we're doing our job correctly. And so clearly the concerns of rationalists are not quite the same as those of empiricists. Knowledge obtained through reasoning should in some sense be sounder and more justified, but at the expense of being less in connection with the world, as it were. Now, nobody is purely a rationalist or an empiricist, and this is not a football match where we have to decide the winner. There are groups of concerns that arise again and again, and as we will see, practice within the cognitive sciences sometimes emphasizes matters to do with the intellect and reason, and other times emphasizes matters to do with observation, perception, and experience. And then we met René Descartes, who was working in the first half of the 17th century, a time in which modern science was in its infancy, was still learning to find its feet, and the everyday practice of modern science was in no way free of the obligations and concerns of the religious authorities and political authorities, who were often the same at that time. We associate Descartes in the context of this course primarily with rationalism, because he explicitly tried to get away from the problem of error in perception, misperception, hallucination, illusion, and to focus on what he thought was the proper domain of mind, which is to apply reason and logic over the domain of ideas. Now, in this way, Descartes pretty much invented our modern notion of mind, not a scientific notion, but our everyday notion of mind. And he invented it out of whole cloth. We cannot get away from this, even though his arguments, his metaphysics, his assumptions are nothing but problematic. Everyone wants to get away from Descartes, but we have a hard time doing it because he made some very compelling arguments. He was a very good philosopher. And the way in which he set things up leaves us landed with a problem of minds that don't appear to be in worlds, with a mind-world duality that is a problem. Now remember, Descartes was not, even though his writings contain some slightly dodgy proofs for God, what he was really doing was not trying to make science acceptable to the theologians. He was trying to clear an area for science to get on and be the best science that it could, without having to worry about things like scriptural authority and the priests and the bishops. But the solution he came up with, which divided reality into two entirely distinct domains, one of what we now call material physical stuff, he called it extended stuff, res extensa, stuff that takes up space, and the other unobservable, not locatable in space, the realm of thought, res cogitans, the thinking stuff. Now, separating those and characterizing them as if they were separate substances, instead of mind being a way of talking about the same reality as physics is a way of talking about, landed us with this problem of trying to get them to interact. And we need to make clear here that for Descartes, at this beginning of modern science, science was developing the idea, which we now take for granted, I suppose, in some respects, of natural law. That there's stuff that goes on in accordance with fixed deterministic principles. This was going to become the science of mechanism, in which things happen in accordance with natural law. And for Descartes, animals belonged to this mechanistic realm. Animals were little machines. So he still is revealing the state of knowledge in the 17th century, because for him humans were a separate part of nature. Humans had souls, which will become characterized as minds later on. And humans had free will. They took responsibility for their actions, they bore responsibility for their actions, and they could choose to act or to not act. For Descartes, this was not true of animals. Now, a lot has happened since. In particular, in the first half of the 19th century, Darwin exploded on the scene and completely changed the way that we understand our own embedding in nature. So we will not be working with Descartes' assumption that humans are separate from animals, distinct from animals. But this was his starting point, and he wanted very much to arrive at a view which allowed humans, through their ability to think and reason, to exercise free will. The picture we inherited then made nobody happy. A dualism arises when you take reality, the whole of a unified reality, and you split it into different domains. In the specific case of René Descartes, we're talking about a division into a material realm, res extensa, and a mental realm, res cogitans. There are other kinds of dualisms around, and it seems that whenever we think or talk or use language to describe our situation in the world, we end up recreating this in some form or another. There are many, many kinds of dualisms, and we'll keep encountering them. There are always those who say, no, this is an artificial distinction. There can only be one domain of the real. That's a position known as monism. Well, which is it? Well, if you're going to favor the physical stuff, you're what's called a physicalist, and that favors matter over mind, sometimes. If you're going to favor the reality of lived experience, of consciousness, then you're something of an idealist, to suggest that matter is not really real. What's really real is my awareness of it. Or there are other positions available. For example, you might say there is only a single domain of reality. It is neither well described in physical terms or in mental terms, but rather out of this we create the illusion of two different realms, but they're both supported by a single underlying reality. That would be a kind of neutral monism, and we do not have time in this course to pursue such debates, unfortunately. They never end. Metaphysical debates are not scientific debates. They're more like religious debates. They're more sort of, what are your unspoken commitments before you ever start doing any science? Metaphysics is primarily concerned with trying to say what we're going to admit to the domain of the real. What is real, sometimes what exists. Being real and existing are not necessarily the same thing, and you can see that these discussions are going to be difficult. Another fundamental concern of Western philosophy has always been epistemology. which is not what is real, but how do we know anything, and how does the world appear to us? What is this business of knowing? At a purely philosophical level, epistemology and metaphysics form a neat pair, sometimes separated, sometimes informing each other, sometimes completely overlapping. From our point of view, we're interested in doing cognitive science, not cognitive philosophy. So we are, to some extent, branching into taking philosophical concerns and applying them in the scientific domain. This is practical epistemology. But such work can never be entirely free of concerns about what's real, about those underlying assumptions we make about what's going on. Now, in Descartes' case, the division into thinking stuff, where decisions are made, for example, and extended stuff, which is governed by the laws of mechanics or deterministic nature, there was always the problem of how did these interact? And we mentioned that Descartes certainly never solved that problem. He helped himself to the pineal gland, dangling below the brain, because nobody knew what it was for, and he said that's where they interact. And in doing so, he was presenting one, it must be said, half-baked attempt to get mental events into a logical sequence and physical events into a logical sequence and still have them interact with one another. So down in the bottom left there, you see interaction dualism. That suggests that physical events influence mental events and mental events influence physical events. It requires a conduit, a channel of some kind between them, which for Descartes was the pineal gland, and this is complete rubbish. There's no such role for the pineal gland under any kind of modern understanding of glands of reality. So that didn't really work, but there were other people who tried different approaches to get this to work. Epiphenomenalism is a particularly pessimistic kind of approach. On this view, physical events stand in a causal sequence, causes followed by effects, all governed by natural law. There are mental events such as perceivings, imaginings, dreamings, hallucinatings, decidings, and so on, but they are purely, they don't actually influence things. They're what are called epiphenomena. They arise from the real reality of physical events in causal sequence. And so on this view, you think you have free will, you think you choose and determine, but that's a load of poppycock. You are actually a helpless spectator of everything that's going on. That's why I called it a particularly pessimistic kind of framing. Certain religious schools have taken this up, like the predeterminism of Calvinism, in which everyone is already born with their fate already decided. They've adopted forms of this, but no scientific view and no modern worldview would really accept this. It's a very pessimistic view. Another way of trying to get this to work is to say, right, there's the physical stuff going on in res extensa. There's the mental stuff going on in the other domain, in the thinking domain. So we've got mental stuff followed by more mental stuff, and physical stuff followed by more physical stuff, and they don't actually interact, but nevertheless they are magically aligned so that when I decide, it seems to have consequences in the physical realm when I decide to pick something up. Now that requires something that's sitting over the whole lot to make sure that things are properly registered. It requires, in other words, some kind of an overarching God. And so that's not really going to do us here as well. That's the psychophysical parallelism. And you don't have to learn these. I put them up just to show you that the dualistic opposition that Descartes set up is really problematic if you try to get it to work to explain anything to do with human behavior or human sense of agency. So it's not going to work. The Cartesian view of mind as entirely separate from everything introduces other sort of logical traps and possibilities that we might not be happy with. One was introduced in the 20th century as a thought experiment called the brain in a vat. And we could discuss it in that form, but we could also discuss it as it arises as the plot of the first Matrix film. Many of you have seen the first Matrix film. If you haven't, do yourself a treat. It's a great film. 2 and 3 are lousy. But 1 is really good. Spoiler alert, in the Matrix, it's a dystopian future in which people are being farmed for bioenergy. Don't worry about that, it's for bioenergy, we'll just accept that. So they're kept in pods, and they have no real life that we might think of, but they're kept happy because they're plugged in through some electrical connection in the back of their head into a computer simulation that convinces them that they're out and about, living as free beings in a world in 1999. It's a computer simulation. Well, the brain in a vat is a similar idea, which suggested that, well, hang on, you think you're sitting in a lecture theatre right now. Maybe you're actually a brain in a vat on the desk of an evil scientist, hooked into a computer providing the right inputs and the right outputs to make you think that you're sitting in the lecture theatre. Many people believe they're actually brains in vats. And I'm not going to believe that you believe it actually, because it's such a stretch. It's an interesting stretch though, because Descartes' idea that your mind is separate from the world opens the door to this particular problem. And when I ask people to describe the brain in a vat experiment, the answers I get are, well, maybe it's all a simulation. That's not the point. The point is, what did you have to assume to make it even potentially plausible that it's all a simulation? And here's what you had to assume. You had to assume that the brain generates experience on the basis of electrical signals, which are inputs and outputs to a center here. Now, the rest of the body is irrelevant, that it's electrical signals going in and coming out, that's all that's relevant. Those coming in are sensory in nature and underscore perception. Those going out are motor in character and cause the body to move. That's what you had to assume to make this even halfway as plausible. And all of those assumptions are entirely optional. We could not assume them. So the point of the brain in the vat experiment is not, hey, maybe it's all a simulation. The point of the brain in a vat experiment is, if you can think of that logically, then you're making these assumptions about brains. And you should be aware that you're making these assumptions. There is work that carries on making these assumptions, but there's work that questions these assumptions as well. So Descartes is really opening up several cans of worms here. Another can of worms that becomes available is a philosophical position nobody wants to take, just like the brain in the vat, and that's solipsism. Well, let me just jump ahead. Solipsism is the unlikely idea that you're actually the only consciousness in the universe, you personally. Everyone else is a replicant, a philosophical zombie, nothing more than an animated toaster, but you, because you have access to your thoughts and emotions and feelings, congratulations, the rest of us are all somehow fake. Nobody's going to argue seriously for solipsism. But Descartes' characterization of minds as entirely separate from a world opens the door to that. Now, here's a little problem in cognitive science. Nobody believes that Cartesian dualism is an accurate or a believable picture of the universe, and we've seen lots of problems with it. But an awful lot of our scientific practices act as if it was a reasonable picture. Mind is treated as one realm, and the material world is treated in another realm. We will today finish up the class with the exploration of the domain of psychophysics, which seems to assume something like this. Everybody likes to bash this philosophically, but it has so informed our view of ourselves that we have great difficulty getting away from it. It's not that Descartes was evil. Descartes simply made clear a deep problem that we have to face as we collectively go forward into scientific modernity. So, if you are seduced by Descartes' view and you think, perhaps I am the only conscious thing in the universe and everyone else is just a robot, you're probably in a room on your own when you're having that thought, because it's a very difficult thought to have when you're in a room with other people. As soon as you collectively occupy a shared space, you are actually not collectively separate. You're not a bunch of individuals observing each other from a great distance. You are very much present to each other. So the best antidote to solipsism, should it ever arise as a danger in your life, is go have a chat to someone. It doesn't seem nearly as plausible then. Okay, we've spent enough time on Descartes, but he'll keep coming back to haunt us. He's going to be our poster boy for this rationalist tradition. We need to say a little bit more about empiricism. We'll have a lot more to say in the scientific context about this. Now, there are many people associated with empiricism, but around this time, about 100 years later than Descartes, we get the most important of the empiricists, David Hume, and before him John Locke, and there was also Bishop Berkeley, an Irishman. So these are collectively known as the British empiricists, who conveniently are an Irishman, a Scotsman, and an Englishman. So you can cue your own jokes on that one. They started with the observation that you don't know anything until you've met it, until you've encountered it, until it's been told to you, or you've seen it with your own eyes, or it's happened to you. You're always learning throughout life, and so your knowledge seems to come from experience and engagement with the world, and this brings to the fore the idea that the world provides evidence for your knowledge, and it can never be 100% sure, which is the character of scientific knowledge anyway, where we know that for a fact. This position contrasts very strongly with that of Descartes. It's going to have lots and lots of consequences. One of the consequences it's going to have is that these two perspectives are going to differ. When they look at an infant child, they're going to see different things. And we will have a lecture or two on infant development later on. From Descartes' position, the rationalist position, this infant has a mind full of clear and perfect and distinct ideas, and it will learn from the world. Descartes is not suggesting anything so outrageous that you would deny that the infant is going to learn from the world, but basically the infant is born as a person with lots of built-in innate concepts and stuff. The empiricist position, with its emphasis on engagement and sensory learning and so on, views the infant as unformed, a blank slate or tabula rasa if we take it to extremes. This contrast often finds expression in what is called the nature-nurture debate. This is the worst game of football in town. We are going to try and avoid playing this game at all. In the history of ideas, it's quite common to identify or delineate extreme points to help us to discuss complex matters. But no self-respecting philosopher or scientist is going to accept such extreme points as being true without any further qualification. So in the case of rationalism and empiricism, we have bunches of concerns that will keep arising. When this gets exaggerated into the wrong claim that a specific behavior should be attributed to either built-in biological stuff or the effects of experience, education, learning, parents, culture, then we end up with this crazy dichotomy of nature versus nurture. Let's come back to Christopher Robin, who we met in the last lecture, who killed his grandmother. This is a problem. We don't like people who kill their grandmother. So the first question we're going to have about Christopher Robin is, was he born bad or was he made bad? Right? Did he do this because he's just a degenerate, he was born hopeless? Or was he turned that way by his parents and bad schooling and so on? Now there's shades of exactly this debate when you read about, for example, what should we do with people who fought for ISIS coming back to Ireland? The question is, are they inherently bad, or was it just the environment that made them bad? That's a false dichotomy just as much as this matter-mind is a false dichotomy. It suggests a simple polarization that we can never, that will never map onto the world we live in, because we've never found someone who was not both a biological entity and who had emerged in context. There's nobody who's free of their environment. There's nobody who's pure biology or pure culture. Now, obviously all these questions are very hard questions. We will get on to more tractable questions as this module progresses. One metaphysical position that seemed to many people to offer one way around or to negotiate this is given to you in your required readings, and this grew up and could only grow up in the second half of the 20th century after a particular view of brains as computational devices grew up. It required a technical language that was not available before about 1950. It required the notion of an artificial intelligence, and it is taken seriously by some neuroscientists and some cognitive scientists, but not by all. And this is the idea that when we speak of mind, what we're speaking about is what your brain is doing. It's not quite brain in a vat. There's lots of details that need to be fleshed out, and you have this in your required reading for this topic so that you get that view. Not so that you take it on board and start believing it, but so that you know that this view exists. And the second reading you have is from Louise Barrett. It has this wonderful title, Why Brains Are Not Computers, Why Behaviorism Is Not Satanism, and Why Dolphins Are Not Aquatic Apes, which presents a rival view. Again, you're not required to accept it at all. What I'm trying to do with the reading is to show you contrasting positions, both of them more or less current. One, the minds and brains position, is an example of what we will call and become familiar with as the computational theory of mind. And the other one is a rival view from the probably less well-known embodied cognitive science perspective. And we'll be constantly meeting these themes as the module progresses. Now, we're going to shift gears now and look a little bit at science done in this area. And most people, when they think of minds and science, are going to think of psychology. So that's the discipline we're going to talk about. But we'll see that psychology has a particular history, and that there's different kinds of psychology, and that there's a lot to discuss here. So philosophers don't work in splendid isolation. They're hopefully talking about something that matters to us, and one of the things that matters to us is our scientific understanding of ourselves. If we characterize psychology as the scientific study of all things mental, we've done it an injustice. Psychology is some of that, and it's an awful lot more of that. Psychology has scientific aspects to it and non-scientific aspects to it. The term psychology itself goes back to the 16th century, but as a scientific field, it only goes back about 150 years. And psychology arises not from science. It arises from the need to take care of each other. When we employ psychological vocabulary, we're interested in people's suffering. We're interested in exercising duties of care. We're interested in the good stuff, pleasurable stuff, the bad stuff, suffering. We're interested in all these, and that's where psychology comes from. So when we have clinical psychology, and we have counseling, and we have psychotherapy, none of those is really, strictly speaking, scientific fields. So we should not mistake psychology for a purely scientific thing. But there has arisen a scientific field that addresses psychological concerns. And it has many parts to it, there's many, many sides to it. And it goes back to the second half of the 19th century. The first experimental laboratory for psychology was opened in Leipzig in Germany by Wilhelm Wundt there in 1879. Just for comparison, around the same time in Knock, in County Mayo, the Virgin Mary was appearing. We got an airport out of it, but there's a lot more psychology labs than there is airports for virgin apparitions. Leipzig is in Germany, so there was a European component to this and there was an American component to this. So William James will stand for the American component. He was over in Boston. He wrote the first textbook in the field called The Principles of Psychology. That came out in 1890. Pretty much all the psychologists, like all the scientists of the time, were males, and very often with these big beards. That's all entirely optional now. And there was a reason that it happened then and not before then and not after then. Psychology couldn't arise before the middle of the 19th century because the church wouldn't have allowed it. There were scientific findings that were very thought-provoking, that led one to wonder about the relationship between brains and minds and so on, and about the role of electricity in all this. For example, in the previous century it had been shown that you could make a dead frog's leg twitch by applying electrical current to it. That was exciting. And At the start of the 19th century, the book Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley in exile in Switzerland. She could not have written the book in England. It would have been illegal. She would have been locked up for that book, because it explored this idea that you could, with scientific knowledge, put together meat and animate meat. You could, as it were, take on the role of a god. Mary Shelley was drawing on scientific ideas of the time, among others from Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. And it was in the first half of the 19th century that Charles Darwin now landed like a bombshell. And after Darwin, we needed a way of understanding ourselves that put us back into nature. Remember, for Descartes, animals were all machines. But humans were like little gods. We had free will and agency. Well, after Darwin, that was no longer going to be an option. We need to understand. We're still working on this. We're still working out the consequences of Darwin. We still have to see ourselves not as separate from nature. We have a long history of that, but as part of the natural world. Furthermore, at this time, the scientific method had started to pay off in spades. In every field, in the physical sciences and the chemical sciences, we had enormous changes. We had the discovery of magnetism, the relationship between electricity and magnetism. We had changes in the manner of production, so that we had the Industrial Revolution. People were suddenly now moving to the cities to work in factories. Every time there was a scientific discovery, there was technological discoveries that changed people's lives. So science is paying off in spades. And of course, when you have something, an activity that is so apparently beneficial or so effective, one of the things you're going to ask about, hey, could we turn it on ourselves? Could we characterize ourselves? That's where the discipline of psychology comes from, the application of the scientific method to human existence and living. Now that that's possible, because the church has backed out of things. It should be obvious to you that there's a fundamental problem with this. Up till then, most science was happy characterizing the world, what Descartes would have called the external world, characterizing the world by keeping the observer, the scientists themselves, out of the picture. A simplistic understanding of what it is, what an objective account is an account that is, in some respects, independent of the person who creates the account. Now, when you start to do science of yourself, that includes the scientist, this separation between object and subject, of an objective world and a shadowy, untrustworthy mental, this becomes problematic. So that in the science of psychology and in the cognitive sciences, we will not be able to rely on a simplistic notion of objectivity. Very important. William James was extremely prolific. He was a brilliant writer, as was his brother Henry James, a very famous novelist. Now here's a passage speaking of a metaphor that William James introduced. In it he said, consciousness does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. It flows. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. In talking of it hereafter, let us call it the stream of thought, of consciousness, or of subjective life. He referred to the stream of consciousness as the ultimate fact for psychology. Now, not everyone agreed with him. That's William James's take on things, and he had his particular take on things. But that term, the stream of consciousness, entered the language at that point, and we still use it. It's a style, and among other things, it's a literary genre. If you ever read any of the early writings of Bob Dylan, they're very much stream of consciousness. We speak of the stream of consciousness, we kind of know what we mean. That idea was very much of its time, and it entered not just the science, but the literature of the time. It's only from this point on, from the late 19th century, that in novels you get inside the characters' heads, that there's talk of what they were silently thinking, perceiving, that the narrative stream includes this separation between the interiority of a mind and the public events in the world. That's true of Henry James, it's very true of James Joyce. If you've read Ulysses or Portrait of the Artist, you're inside the heads of characters all the time. It's true of Virginia Woolf, of Dostoevsky. In Crime and Punishment, if you read it, you walk around convinced you killed the old woman with an axe. That keeps happening in this module. What's going on with that? So, in some respects, this notion of the stream of consciousness had more concrete and substantial effects on literature than it did on science. But you can get a sense of William James's priorities here. As well as the principles of psychology, he wrote another very famous book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. Now, he was not interested in religion and discussing beliefs or superstitions or rituals or rites. He was interested in what it's like. He was very aware that there were other cultures, and the people in other cultures were very grounded in their worlds in a different way to a Protestant in the northeast of the United States. So his work was influenced by and some knowledge of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy, but by this general cultural sensitivity, and his interest was in coming to terms with the fact that different people experience their being in the world in very different ways. This kind of sensitivity gave rise to an American school of philosophy called pragmatism. William James is one of the founders of that. John Dewey and Charles Peirce will be others. A pragmatist approach doesn't really try to nail down truth. It says, okay, you've got a story. What's in it first? How useful are your ideas? Rather than getting lost in endless metaphysical debate, if you're going to come up with a theory of mind or of behavior or something like this, let's ask, is it any use? Do we benefit from it? And it gives rise then to a bunch of scientific accounts, which are not necessarily all unified and unifiable, but which allow science to be of practical use in very many areas of life. In some respects, cognitive science has a duty to be pragmatic, because we will never settle the metaphysical questions, and we need science to be of use to human lives. This is the point also at which the self-help strand of psychology emerges, and it's also William James, who was such an influential character. But if you go down to the newsstands, you'll see things like pop magazines like Psychology Today, which are full of lifestyle advice telling you what you should and should not do, and how to be mindful and take care of yourself and set yourself goals and deal with criticism and all that kind of stuff. That's not science. That's popular psychology in the self-help tradition, and it's entirely continuous with the older notion of psychology as a means of taking care of each other using whatever concepts we have. So a lot of this runs through William James, and if you're back there at the start of at the end of the 19th century, and you want to begin to do scientific work in a new field, science of the self, how do you do it? Science of the mind. Well, the answer is you throw the book at it. You do everything you can. And of course, one thing you do, and people have always done, is argue from their armchairs, use reason. That's basically philosophy. There was a field founded there, which is about the only continuous field in psychological science, called psychophysics. And we'll have a look at that to finish up the lecture today. But there was also a wide variety of experimental vehicles brought into bear, and we continue to generate ever new forms of experimental inquiry. At the time, one very popular thing to look into was mesmerism, or what we now call hypnosis, which seems to give all kinds of insights into the mind and the relationship between people. The notion of executive control was changed in hypnosis. Hypnosis is still a fascinating subject, even though, of course, has a shadow history as a form of popular entertainment. But we've never stopped coming up with ever cleverer ways to ask experimental questions. And later on, we'll see introspection, or just looking into your workings of your own mind, has a particular role here, which we'll come back to. But for now, today, I want to look at psychophysics. And I want to point out that I said nobody's happy with dualist metaphysics, with Cartesian substance dualism. It doesn't work. And I said that the dirty secret of cognitive science is we often act as if it did work. Well, nowhere is that clearer in psychophysics, and strangely enough, that's the one field of psychology that has a continuous history from the 1890s to the present day. Every other branch of psychology has undergone revolution after revolution, throwing everything out, reinventing the wheel, new paradigms, new changes. Psychophysics is a constant. And it's weird as hell. So, who here is confident they know what psychophysics is? Okay. Psychophysics has to do with psychology, or the mind, and physics, or stuff we measure. Now we know how to measure physical properties of lots and lots of things. We can do chemical analysis, we have microphones, we have meters of all kinds, and we're confident in the field of measurement. Some of the things we measure influence what we perceive or how we experience the world. And perception is something that is inherently first person, not observable from the outside. And there seems to be a relation between the things we can measure and the things that influence our perception. So we're going to just take an example from the domain of sound. The word sound itself is ambiguous. I could be talking in a physical register, in which case I'm talking about vibration in the air, the movement of air particles with specific energies. There's an event, a collision event over here, that causes the air to vibrate, which causes your eardrums to waggle. And God knows what happens after that. But that's one meaning of sound. And another meaning of sound is purely perceptual. It's what you hear. That was a clap, and it has certain properties. Now, the only way to find out what you perceive is to ask you. In fact, what we're going to do in this domain of psychophysics is this weird business of we're going to enforce Cartesian dualism. If we can measure it, it belongs in the physical side of things. If we can only get at it by asking you, it's in the psycho side of things. And so here, for example, one of the things we can measure about sound is how rapid are the vibrations. If we have regular vibrations, not all sounds are like that, but if we have regular vibrations, we hear it as pitched. So here's a sound. And that was generated by making something vibrate at 100 cycles per second. Now if we make it vibrate at 200 cycles per second, does that sound higher or lower? Hands up for higher, hands up for lower. We all agree. Agree. Okay, we may be doing psychology stuff here, but we found a great deal of agreement. If there's any musicians in the audience, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me that one was an octave higher than the other. So you're all familiar with the layout of a keyboard on a piano. If you hit the note C here, and you go up a few, there's another C, and they kind of sound like the same, only higher. And an octave is sort of perceptually a fixed distance. So let's add another 100 hertz. We had 100, and then we had 200. Maybe 300 will be an octave higher. It's not. I'm not going to give you a musical quiz here. That's a fifth higher. We have to go to 400 hertz to get a note that sounds like it's an octave higher than 200 hertz. So every time we double the frequency, we seem to move an equal distance in the perceptual space. So go to 800, 1600. You can see that's basically the same note, just recurring higher and higher. So there's some kind of a lawful relationship between what we're measuring, which is frequency, and what we're hearing, which is pitch. But it's not necessarily a simple relationship. It's not that fixed increments of frequency lead to fixed changes in pitch. In fact, you need to double the frequency in order to move up a fixed amount of pitch. It's more complicated than that, and here's a plot of frequency. That's the thing we can measure, that's physically measurable down here. And here's the pitch, that's the perceptual effect. And you can see it's not even a straight line, it's a curved line. How do you do psychophysical experiments? Well, basically, you keep presenting people with the opportunity to give you feedback on what they heard or saw or felt. So you can ask them, were these two things the same or not? And then you can look to see, well, how different do they have to be before people can notice them as the same? If I give you a 100 hertz tone, and supposing you don't notice, it sounds the same as 101 hertz, but at 105 it sounds different. Well, what about 1,000 hertz? Would 1,005 sound different? So you can study this, the threshold of sensitivity, or what we call just noticeable differences. Or I can give you knobs and get you to adjust things so that one sounds similar to the other or identical to the other, or one is twice as high, intense, or what have you, as the other. So there's lots of methods where you give people the opportunity to compare things, and what you're always doing is comparing what you know on the one side, the physical measurements, with people's reports on the other side. So this is pure Cartesian dualism, and it's also science, and we have no clue what we're doing. This is crazy, and it's great, because this is the one bit of psychology that has remained from the 1870s to the present day. We just did that here. We measured frequency, but we heard pitch. Things we can measure here all belong in the physical domain. When we measure the amount of energy in the vibration, we're dealing with amplitude. Perceptually, that's loudness. And the relationship between the two is very complicated. But we can measure amplitude, and we can ask you about loudness, and we can explore that relationship. If we're talking about light, we can measure luminosity. That has to do with the number of photons a light source emits. But we can ask you about brightness. We can get more complicated about this. We could go down to O'Brien's and get some fine French wines, and we could do a chemical assay and find out what are the chemicals in the fine French wine. And we could ask you to describe it, and you could go, it has a bouquet of cherries and an aftertaste of leather and raspberries. And we could try to relate the two. Turns out that wine tasting vocabulary is not nearly as stable. I think you're not surprised to hear that. But we could do the same game. We can do it in touch. We can apply a pressure of a fixed force, and we can see, okay, does this feel twice as strong, half as strong? Can you notice the difference between these? So we can do this in different modalities. And in each case, there's stuff we measure, and there's stuff that we have to ask about. And the stuff we have to ask about, by definition, we can't measure. If we could measure it, it goes in the physical column. So we've kind of built up a weird field that enforces Cartesian dualism, and yet gives us very good science, very strong science, and opens the door to asking lots of questions. Psychophysics gives you a good example of many of the puzzles that arise when we take the scientific method and start applying it to our perceptions, our imaginations, our memories, our dreams, and so on. We'll have lots more of them, but as you can see, the philosophy is always just behind us. It's never far away. Right, that's the briefest of introductions to psychophysics, and we pick up the story with continuing the history of psychology on Tuesday.